Okay, well, as you can see, if we're talking a little bit about prophecy, I think everyone's aware of the earthquakes of Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, and the potential relation to Israel, because Israel is starting to feel some reverberations from them. This has nothing to do with that, but it's in the way of prophecy, so it's very much of interest to us. So as you can tell, this morning we're going to be talking about World War I. Often called the Great War, particularly at the time, World War I was an incredibly significant event, particularly in light of Bible prophecy. But I also want to talk about this in relation to the traditional view that Brother Thomas put forth of prophecy. Because today, there's different, the way I think of it, there's different classes of thought or different houses of thought on prophecy. And I've wondered, why is this? It's not just simply, I think, way of interpretation of certain things. But when did these different classes of thought arise? And perhaps some of them always have, but I think generally speaking, we're back at Brother Thomas's time in the 1800s. I think most people were probably of the same general view. And so in an effort to try to understand when these different views came about and why, I decided to go back and study what he taught, primarily in Elpis Israel and Eureka, those two books up there. And I found, when I was studying these things, the basis for his beliefs. It's not just, I believe this, but here's why I believe this, which is critical. And I found that World War I was a pivotal point. And this is if we're trying to figure out a single event that kind of changed things, I would say it's this. Because it changed the world in ways which Brother Thomas did not foresee. There's been 2 world wars so far. It seems we're on the cusp of a third. But neither of those Brother Thomas foresaw looking to the future. And both of them resulted in so many different changes on the world scene that I think we really can't see from Brother Thomas's day, because we're really only told about them insofar as they relate to Israel. And we'll talk about that a little bit here today. But so the point is, most of the details of World War I and II, Brother Thomas he just didn't have the information, and he didn't live long enough to see both things that are not to his credit. So this morning, I want to trace events from the time that he lived. We're going to look at what he believed and why. And we're going to trace events from the time he fell asleep up to and through World War I. And we'll see what went as he predicted, and some of it's absolutely remarkable. But we'll also see what went different and the ramifications of some of those things. And there's a lot that gets tied in here, but I think going about it in the way we're going to do it this morning is at least a good way to start considering these things. And I think it's important because, right now, as we talk about Latter-day prophecy, there's things starting to go on, but our lives are relatively unaffected. We still go about our days as normal. So talking about what's going to happen Latter-day prophecy, it almost seems like it's kind of think what you want in a way. Nobody actually thinks it, I think. But the thing is, when things actually start to come to pass and they start affecting us, I think it can either strengthen our faith or shake our faith, depending on what we're expecting. So we need to take as many facts as possible into account. And we have over 150 years of history at our disposal, which Brother Thomas didn't because he fell asleep. And certain things simply didn't come to pass as he expected. And as these latter-day events, they relate to one another. So it's kind of like a domino effect. So obviously, this is in no way to disrespect Brother Thomas or anything at all, but an earnest attempt to understand the truth of the scriptures and their perfection. We want our faith to be strengthened when things come to pass. And if we're expecting a certain thing to happen and it doesn't, or it goes the opposite direction, it may actually work to hopefully not, but hope to potentially harm our faith. So I don't think anybody, obviously myself included, had everything correct. As we'll see through this, there's certain things that happen that he couldn't foresee. I think that's true today. But we need to make our best effort, I think. like I said, there's endless approaches just because Latter-day events are all interrelated. You see a cause and effect relationship. But I think if we focus specifically on what he believed about Britain, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, it makes the import of these things the easiest to see. As I have up there, Elpis Israel, that was written originally in 1848, and it underwent a couple different editions throughout his life. And Eureka, the first edition, I think, was published in 1861. Now, so far, when studying these two things, his understanding prophecy is the same. So it's not like he wrote in Elpis Israel and then he had a better understanding that he recorded in Eureka. So far from what I found, everything's the same. And he fell asleep in March of 1871. So any world events, obviously, that happened after he died, he couldn't take into account. But really, to properly understand what he believed and taught, we need to understand the world in which he lived. As he fell asleep in 1871, I wanted to see what did these three main powers look like in 1871. Now, obviously, there's no map on the internet of these three powers when Brother Thomas died, so I had to make it. I compared a bunch of different maps to make sure they were fairly accurate. So if anybody's interested in this map, I'd be happy to share it with you. But the red is the British Empire, the yellow is the Ottoman Empire, and the blue is the Russian Empire. So as you can see, in these days, the British Empire still existed. Now, they had Australia, they had a bunch of other places throughout the world, but we're really only interested in the ones that he thought related to prophecy. So there were some in Africa, but we're going to focus on this region. The Ottoman Empire had the land from Libya through Egypt all the way up to modern Turkey and into some of Europe. And you note, importantly, Palestine, or the land of Israel, was under Ottoman control. Israel did not exist, and the Jews were still in exile. And now Russia, their borders really aren't that different from today. But still, it's important to know where they were at this time. Now, when you're reading his works, he doesn't usually say, all right, I'm going to talk just about what this one thing to where we can easily understand the role of each. He brings a lot of things in at once. So I'll summarize what he believed, and then we'll read some quotes that verify that. But if we're to break it down to a sort of elevator pitch, he believed that these latter-day wars that would result in Christ's return would result from Britain expanding their empire, Russia expanding theirs, and a clash that would ensue between the two expanding empires. So Russia would initially be looking west, and they would take into their empire the 10-toe kingdoms of Europe. For the sake of this time, we're just going to assume Europe is the 10-toe, all of Europe is the 10-toe kingdoms. Now, in doing this, it would worry Britain because they would start encroaching on Britain's territories. The Ottoman Empire, which occupied this land of Palestine and Jordan, it would be enticed by these frog-like spirits that Revelation 16 talks about that would go out and bring the nations of the world to the battle of Armageddon. So he thinks that the Ottomans would be kind of puffed up and think, we are strong enough to fight Russia. So they would fight against them, but they would lose. This is when Russia would come down and they would overtake the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. And thus, as Revelation 16 says, it would dry up the Euphrates River, or referring to the Ottoman Empire. Russia also would have taken all of the land of her allies. So all the allies in Ezekiel 38, Iran, and so on. He thought that instead of just being allies, they were actually going to take over them and absorb them into their empire. Now, in response, Brother Thomas expected Britain to add a number of colonies to her empire to sort of combat. Russia would make a move, and to counter it, Britain would try to make one. So they would take Egypt. And this would be to protect their trade with India. You can see India at this time is a British colony. They would also take these southern Arabian countries, which is Sheba and Dedan. And they would also take this land here that he understood as Edom, Ammon, and Moab. And they would also take the land of Palestine. Now, it is at this time when Britain takes the land of Palestine, that they would allow the Jews to come back. Palestine would be a British colony. The Jews would come back to the land, and that's when, well, obviously the Jews would come back from their dispersion. And it would be through British trade with India. This is how Israel would get the wealth and the safety that Ezekiel 38 describes. Because Israel at this time, they're a land of unwalled villages. They have goods and cattle. Britain would be the means of their safety, and their wealth would come from trading with India. So the British Empire and their colonies is critical for this. So as Russia would have defeated the Ottomans, it would be at this time that they go southward. And this is what Brother Thomas believes, Daniel 11, 40 through 45, the king of the north, king of the south. That's what he thought this was talking about. They would descend upon the British colonies of Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt, and Britain would fight them, but Russia would win. Now, if there's Jews there, they're now in Russian captivity, and this would require salvation from Christ. So this is why he thought Christ would come to save the Jews after Gog comes over and takes over everything. Now that's a simplified version, but that's essentially what he teaches in Elpis Israel and Eureka. Now we're not going to read Daniel 11, 40 through 45, but I do want to start with Revelation 16, 12. Now it's critical. I've got it up on the board here too, but yeah, I do encourage to look it up on your own. Now, Brother Thomas believed that this passage in Daniel 11, when I say Daniel 11, I'm talking about verses 40 and 45, just for the sake of me being able to talk easy. I'm going to say Daniel 11. He believed both of them referred to the end of the Ottoman Empire, specifically the Ottoman Empire. They're parallel passages in his mind. Revelation 16, 12 through 14, through the end of the chapter is pertinent. This is what we'll read. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Now, as I mentioned, the river Euphrates is a symbolic term for the Ottoman Empire because Turkey is where the Euphrates River begins. Now, of critical importance, the Ottoman Empire, as you can see, they had all of the Euphrates in their borders. Now, it begins in Turkey, but only the Turkish Ottoman Empire encapsulated all of the river. Now, the drying up of the river, therefore, symbolizes the drying up of the empire. It would shrink, it would just dissolve. And this, as we just saw, Brother Thomas would believe would happen by Russia. Now, note the reason why the empire dries up. In Revelation 16, the only reason it has to dry up is that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Well, who are these kings of the east? Brother Thomas thought it referred to Christ and the saints. There's a verse that talks about Christ, from the sun's rising and so on, or Christ being called the Son of Righteousness. And as the sun rises in the east, that would kind of be starting a new day, and that's why he thought this is Christ and the saints. Now, as Russia defeating the Ottomans would require the Jews to be saved by Jesus, that's why he thought the drying up of the Euphrates prepared the way for Christ. That makes sense. See the correlation there. That's the domino effect that immediately results in Christ's return. And it's in that sense that the drying up prepares the way for Christ and the saints. So, this is important. I forgot to show this. So these are Turkey's borders today. You can see it still starts in Turkey. Euphrates does, but they don't encapsulate all of the river anymore. And that's why you can tell it's already dried up. I already got to the punchline of my talk, but it's already dried up. There it goes. Now it doesn't really equate anymore. It's dried up. Now, just a couple things, and you'll see that he equates Revelation 16 with Daniel 11 and also Ezekiel 38 through these things from his verbiage. It says the overthrow of the Ottoman Sultan, Sultan's the name for the Ottoman ruler, will not be contemplated by the British government with indifference. So at this time, Russia's already taken over Turkey, the Ottomans. In Britain, it says they will unquestioningly adopt all possible measures to circumvent the Russian autocrat, which is the name of the Russian leader. England's Indian Empire and its contiguity to Asiatic Russia make her its natural enemy. It will be her policy to prevent him from taking possession of Egypt and the Holy Land. For if he were to do this, he would intercept all communication between England and India by the Red Sea. Hence, while she is a natural enemy of the autocrat, she is also the natural friend of Egypt and the Jews. The enemy of the enemy is my friend, sort of thing. Triumph of Russia in the West, so Russia's already taken Europe at this time, will cause Britain, to strengthen herself against the East. And as I shall show, she, Britain, will take possession of Sheba, Dedan, Edom, Moab, and part of Ammon, and colonize Judea with Israelites, and form an intimate alliance of offense and defense with Egypt. Thus, the Red Sea will become a British lake, and by holding Gibraltar, Aden, and some of commanding position at the entrance of the Persian Gulf, she will be enabled to retain for a short time longer her commercial and maritime ascendancy. So, see, they're worried about Russia, therefore they take Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine. But these measures of the British will be the means of luring the autocrat to his destruction. The prosperity of Egypt and Judea will tempt him to seize him for himself. So it's like he comes down to Turkey, and then he wasn't planning to go to Israel, or Palestine at the time, but think, if they got riches, I might as well continue going south. They will tempt him to seize him for himself, for as the prophet saith, he shall also enter also into the glorious land, and many shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He will have proclaimed war against the east. The war will be bloody, and his hosts like a cloud to cover their land. Having overrun Syria and Persia, he will invade Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. For it is written, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold, of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans and Ethiopians shall be at his step. The subjugation of Egypt shall arouse all the indignation of Britain. England's interference troubles him. For tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore shall he go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. He will lay siege to Jerusalem and take it, for he shall pitch his palatial tents in the glorious holy mountain. Yet, though thus far triumphant, he shall come to his end, and none shall help him by the hand of Christ. And he talks about that a little bit elsewhere. But you see, it's encroachment on Britain's empire that provokes Britain to occupy Palestine and begin this war. He further says that it's because of Britain's vast interests in India. Again, speaking of the necessity for something to spark a war, he says the political element is found in the commercial interests of Britain in India. So India is critical to this. In the importance of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, they're important as well. Being in the possession of a friendly people to the preservation of those interests, and in the policy of colonizing Palestine with Jews, and so attaching them to the interests of the country by which they are protected. Thus, the ascendancy of the autocrat of Russia in Constantinople, Turkey, and the West, by the jeopardy in which it puts the commerce and dominion of the land power, excites the British government. Now, some of these things he was incredibly right about. Other things happened differently. So, starting from Brother Thomas's day, let's trace some of these events through history. Again, Britain's empire is critical to all of this. And for the first few decades after he died, it went almost without a hitch. Britain expanded as they thought they would. They had India. I think they had gained India in the 1700s, so they already existed when Brother Thomas wrote. But in 1882, this is 11 years after Brother Thomas died, Britain took Egypt. And they wanted this because, like Brother Thomas thought, it saved Britain so much time to trade with India. Because before they had the Suez Canal, which runs, you can see it on that right map. It essentially is a shortcut from the Mediterranean down to the Red Sea, and it saves Britain from having to go all around the African continent. It's exactly what he predicted. So Egypt was very important to Britain. Now, I don't think he foresaw the Zionist movement specifically, but at this time in 1897, there was the first Zionist Congress. Before that date, they still had some influence on British government. But from this point forward, particularly through Chaim Weizmann, who's going to be a president of Israel one day, heavy influence on the British government, pleading the Jewish cause. And so it worked in line with his predictions of Britain and the Jews. Then in 1914, and this man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he was Austrian, he was assassinated. And this is what many believe escalated to World War I. Now, the greatest importance of this war is that it resulted in the complete demise of the Ottoman Empire. It was completely dried up and extinguished, just as Revelation 16 prophesied. And as the Ottoman Empire was critical to his sequence of events and its drying up and so on, it changes things moving forward, naturally. And it was supposed to cease between Russia and Britain fighting each other. But how did it happen? So in World War I, there were two sides to start. The Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and a little bit after the war began, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. Now, later, the United States and Italy and Japan joined the Triple Entente, and then they were called the Allies. But for the outset, it was the Triple Entente. Now, at the outset, you see something potentially interesting. You have Russia and the Ottomans on opposite sides of the war. Now, Russia hasn't taken Europe yet, which he thought would happen already, but say, okay, this is kind of interesting. But there are a couple important differences. If you notice, it's not Russia against Britain, it's Russia with Britain. They're allies here. It's completely different. And also this didn't start because Russia was taking over a bunch of land. It was completely unrelated to that. But nevertheless, it's continued. So for the first part of the war, Britain was, it really looked like the Triple Entente might lose. There were a lot of divisions going on in the alliance, and they were worried that the Central Powers would get the upper hand. Millions of soldiers had been killed. The Central Powers were making great gains, and there were kind of like rivalries between Britain and France. Now, Britain, they tried to get the U.S. involved in the war from the get-go. Woodrow Wilson was president at the time, but he wanted to keep the U.S. neutral. He was an ardent Christian. He thought that war wasn't good. He was very much an advocate for diplomacy, but he wanted to keep the U.S. neutral so that they could act as a mediator. That's the only thing he wanted the U.S. to do. So eventually the U.S. did join, but it wasn't until 1917, after 3 years after the war began. So at the outset, Britain's like, we got to do something to strengthen our hand here. So what they did is they made a number of deals concerning the territory of the Ottoman Empire in the event that the Entente won. So this is what the Ottoman Empire looked like in 1914. You can see Egypt's no longer in their possession because Britain took it from them in 1882. The dark green is their empire. Arabia, the lighter green, those are vassal states. So it's not really part of their empire, but it's under their influence. Now, to strengthen Britain's alliance with the French, it almost came to the point of breaking the alliance, the rivalry. But to strengthen it, they promised the French a portion of the Ottoman territory. So they say, if we win, you and I, we're gonna take all Ottoman territory to ourselves. Now, this was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement with Sir Mark Sykes and Francois Georges Picot. I think you know who's for France and who's for Britain. So this map this is what they came up with. So part A, that would go to the French as spheres of influence. The dark blue would also be going to France as well. That would be more under their direct control. These weren't colonies, but they were under their spheres of influence. Now, B, that would go to Britain. Also that red there, and those are both southern Iraq and Jordan. Now, the yellow, that is obviously Palestine. That was to be under international control. These two guys could not decide what they wanted to do with it, and they realized international control is not the best, but it's better than the other person getting it. Now you can see there's a little red spot in Palestine. That's Haifa, and that went to Britain also. Now I'm getting ahead of myself, but note that's important. Now the British, this is all contingent upon them winning the war, and it doesn't look like they were going to do it at the time. And they knew that they couldn't defeat the Ottomans on their own. It's really interesting because the Ottomans were called the sick man of Europe. For the past hundreds of years, they were just steadily declining, but they were still a terribly formidable force. So they needed to be weakened. And to accomplish that, Britain took advantage of a movement that was just in the kind of the birth stages of development. It was Arab nationalism. So throughout the Ottoman Empire, there were a bunch of different bands of Arabs that they were growing in their political ambition and their population. They thought, we want states of our own. So Britain and France, seeing this, they said, okay, we can utilize that. So what they did is they essentially told the Arabs, if you guys rise up against your Ottoman overlords, we will support independent Arab states. So in 1915 and 16, this is exactly as Mark Sykes and Picot are negotiating. At the same exact time, Britain negotiated with this man named Ali bin Husseini. He was king of Hejaz. Hejaz is about halfway up the Red Sea there. And he was actually a really unique person because he was of the line of Muhammad. And so therefore, most Arabs revered him. He was a good negotiator for all Arab behalf. So, corresponding with a British High Commissioner on the left, Sir Henry McMahon, he was in Egypt at the time. They had a series of letters where they discussed the Arab, what the Arabs wanted and what Britain would do. And this was called the McMahon-Husseini correspondence. So Hussein offered assistance to Great Britain against the Turks in return for a British promise to recognize the independence of what was to become Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, and most of the Arabian Peninsula, and to endorse the proclamation of Islamic Arab Caliphate. Now, these are not the lands that they were promised. This is what he wanted. It's important. Those maps there, that's what the Arabs wanted. Now, the British knew French people wanted, they wanted a stake in this. French had incurred the heaviest death toll, so they thought, you guys need to give us a cut of this. So what they did when they're talking to the Arabs, McMahon was intentionally ambiguous, very, very vague in what he promised. And he omitted punctuation because he wanted what he said to have the opposite meaning. But they needed Arab support. They had to have it. So McMahon replied that in the event of an Allied victory, Britain would recognize the territory demanded by the Sharif, I think, except for certain areas not purely Arab. And as this encyclopedia says, the imprecision of British promises was the cause of post-war quarrels between Great Britain and Arab nationalists, particularly with regard to Palestine. This is one reason why the Arabs say we own it should be ours because it was promised. Well, it really wasn't. And the whole negotiation, there's a book called The Line in the Sand that talks about it. Incredible. You can see God's hand working in these things because some of these phrases that McMahon put into the letter that would clarify what Britain meant, whenever they were translated into Arabic, those phrases didn't make it in there. So Hussein had this feeling of false confidence that, yes, we've reached a good deal, and that is when they initiated the Arab revolt in June of 1916. So when T.E. Lawrence, you've probably heard of him, this is when he came around. So Britain knows they're being vague and lying to the Arabs, but the Arabs think they have been promised the land without a doubt. Now, Britain still thought they needed more support, though. And we really kind of see a sense of paranoia in Britain's action. So the same things that drove them to negotiate with the French and the Arabs drove them to appeal to Jews. As I mentioned, the Zionist movement had really begun to take stride. And from this point, originally it was just older Jews who were Zionists. But from this point, Jews throughout all the world kind of been infected with this. It was really starting to get ground. So Britain knew there's a lot of Jews in the Central Power territories. And they kind of wanted to help them rise up against the Central Powers. Or at least didn't want them to assist the Central Powers as they lived there. So knowing that a lot of the Jews had prominent roles in those countries, so we need to appeal to them as well. Now, adding to this was the British interest of the Suez Canal. Saw the importance of it. It cut Britain's trip to India drastically. Now, Britain wanted sole control over the canal. It wasn't completely theirs yet. And part of Britain's deal with the Jews was, we'll support Jewish immigration and homeland in Palestine if you support British control of the Suez Canal. So there's a trade-off there. And they also thought that having the Jews in the area, who would have liked Britain for letting them come to Palestine, that they would help kind of protect Britain's interests there. So, aware of this desire for a Jewish homeland, Britain released the Balfour Declaration. It wasn't just that they loved Jews, it's tactical. It's just for Britain's sake. And it says, we'll just read the middle paragraph there. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Sounds pretty straightforward. However, it wasn't without its complication. It's 1917 that this was put out. And again, this concerns territory that then belonged to the Ottomans and was conditional upon the Allied or the Entente winning. So it's the same premise that they gave to two other parties, Arabs and the French. And all of these deals that they made, they're conflicting. I mean, you can't have Palestine be an international zone and an independent Arab state. You can't have it as an independent Arab state if Britain is still allowed to let Jews come in. I mean, it could not work. And Britain is the cause for the Middle East problems that we see today. These deals are the source of it. And then the problems just continue on and on. So we skip to the end of the war. The Allies win, which was the Entente. With the help of the Arabs, the Arab revolt, Britain succeeded in driving the Ottomans out of Palestine. This is an Alabi walking into Jerusalem in 17. Ottomans' participation in the war ended in October of 1918. It was an armistice at this port of Mudros. Now, World War I officially ended in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. And over the next couple of years, the Ottoman territory they were negotiating still how to divide it, and there's a process. But the Ottoman Empire was completely and officially dissolved in 1922, the Treaty of Sevres. So, pause for a second. It was not Russia that defeated the Ottomans on their way to Palestine, but it was Britain. Russia really had almost nothing to do with it. Their involvement with the Ottomans was in the north. There's something called the Caucasus Campaign, which I think is still relevant to prophecy, but not in this way. But Russia, they were suffering so heavily from the Germans that there was actually, this is when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred. They wanted Russia out. The government wouldn't take them out, so the people overthrew the government. This is when Vladimir Lenin headed this Bolshevik party, communists. In March of 1918, this is when, once they overthrew the government, Russia pulled them out of the war. They signed in 1918. You see, the war still went on for a number of months. Russia pulled out early in this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Completely different than what Brother Thomas anticipated. And as we sit here 100 years after the fact, we see that the Ottoman Empire's demise did not prepare the way for Christ and the saints. I mean, in the sense that it was a part of prophecy, yes, but in the sense that he meant it simply didn't. Now that meant, since the Ottoman Empire is dissolved, it's no longer a tenable interpretation of Revelation 16 and therefore Daniel 11. Now, in the next few years, the Ottoman territory was divided as they went, because the French had so heavy influence on them, they went with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, kind of with a touch of the Arab Agreement. Now, just like it stated, Palestine went into international hands. It was the League of Nations. Now, none of these were not, again, they're not colonies. They're just mandates. They have some spheres of influence. Now, in 1922, the League of Nations granted Britain the a mandate for Palestine. So Britain did get Palestine, but it did, like they said, went to international hands. Now, the important thing is, President Wilson had insisted that imperialism needs to end. You can't have empires. You guys need to take these lands and you need to turn them into independent Arab states as quickly as possible. As it says in this line in the sandbook, he told them to steer these embryonic countries to rapid independence. So they installed British rulers in these spheres of influence, British and French influence. And the borders, and this is how we get the Middle East today. You can see it's the same exact map. The borders are absolutely contrary. Mark Sykes, the way he determined this, he says, well, there's a city in Palestine called Acre, and there's a place in Iraq that ends with a K. Well, I want to draw a line from the E to the K, and that's a border. Takes nothing else into account, and it's another source of discord in the region. But it nevertheless shapes the Middle East to what it is today. Now, note the territory that Britain has influence over now. This is what Brother Thomas predicted on the left. In the British Empire in 1922, they gained Iraq, they gained Jordan, and they gained Palestine. And they already had the, I'm trying to think when they had the Oman and Yemen today down in Southern Arabia. But it's exactly as he anticipated. Although the timing isn't right. It didn't happen after the Ottomans were defeated by Russia and so on. But anyways, now when Britain got the mandate for Palestine from the League of Nations, the Balfour Declaration in favor of the Jews, the wording of that was adopted into the British mandate. So the Jews were allowed to come back. And you can imagine how the Arabs reacted to all this. They feel like they had been cheated. And that's, again, why they so much hatred today. But this point right here in 1922, this is where Brother Thomas's, or the correctness of his predictions ends. There's two big things that happened after this. Firstly, contrary to what he believed, the British would not be the source of the safety and wealth that Ezekiel 38 described. In the 1920s and 40s, Britain would take a complete 180 on their tune with the Jews. Now, it was, they actually were protectors of the Jews, because when they first got the mandate in 22 and Jews started coming back, the Arabs hated them. So Britain had to protect them, but things changed. And here's why. The reason Britain wanted Iraq in the Sykes-Picot Agreement was because of oil. Britain does not have oil. I think they have literally one oil well in their whole little island there. So they have to get it from somewhere else. Iraq was rich in oil. So they wanted to be able to take that oil from Iraq, which originally went into their hand, and they wanted to export it, which is why, if you remember, in Palestine, they had just a little port of Haifa belonged to Britain. So we want the oil, we need to get it to us, and they did it from Haifa. Now, as the Jews become more prevalent in the land, they're intelligent people. They really brought a lot of skill and ingenuity to the land, and they kind of, by that, forced a lot of the Arabs out of their jobs in many ways. And so the Arab majority, they were definitely the majority at this time. They protested Jewish immigration. They hated it. And so feeling sidelined by Britain and like Britain had reneged on their promises, they rioted. In 1921, there were the Jaffa riots. This is a violent clash of the Jews and the Arabs. And these only intensified. And this not all of them. There's a lot that went on. These are the big ones. In 1936, there was the Arab Revolt, and this was specifically against British control of the land. And it took Britain 3 years to quell these riots. And it's this incessant rioting and pestering that started to change British favor from the Jews to the Arabs. Now, importantly, something else happened in 1939. It was World War II. Hitler invaded Poland, and now that Britain is going to be involved in another world war, and they have no oil on their own, where are they going to get it? They need to get it from Iraq. They have to have it if they're going to fight the war. Except, problem is, Iraq had declared independence in 1932, 7 years before. So now the oil that they really desperately needed is in Arab hands. In Iraq, being Arabs, who do you think they sympathize with, the Jews or the Arabs? Obviously, they're Arab brothers. So in order for Britain to get this oil, they really changed their tune. And this is represented in a new policy that Britain took. It's called the 1939 White Paper. There's a lot of things this did, and it's a complete 180. It limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over a 5-year period. It's hardly anything at all. But after 5 years, Britain told the Arabs, the Arab majority is now going to get to decide how many Jews come in. How many Jews do you think they're going to let come in? They're not. So Britain's working against God's plan in a way and bringing the Jews back. Because that's the main focus of all this. And they also prohibited Jews from buying land in 95% of mandatory Palestine. So it's the exact opposite. And we won't talk about it a lot today, but the things that Britain did against the Jews, the extent of it's just insane. I've never heard of this before. In 1947, this is a ship called the Exodus. It had 4,500 Jews from Europe coming to Palestine. And I'd always heard this touted, this is fulfillment of prophecy. Britain's bringing the Jews back. Well, no. Britain intercepted that, and they sent them back to Europe because it was illegal immigration in their eyes. Also, when the first Arab-Israeli War broke out in 1948, as soon as Israel declared themselves a nation, Truman, who loved the Jews in the U.S., he tried to get the UN to put out a call for a ceasefire, but Britain told them, they stalled it. And it says, as some of these books say, the reason they stalled it is because it looked like the Arabs were going to win. Britain wanted the Arabs to win. They gave them arms that they were supposed to throw out when they pulled out of Palestine in 1948. They gave them to the Arabs. They funded them. I mean, it's absurd. It could not be more opposite as a protector. They're a vehement enemy of the Jews. And it's the effect of Britain's policies that forced the Jews to come up with the Haganah, the underground intelligence rebellion sort of agency. Well, that's the first thing. Secondly, Britain lost their empire. This empire that is critical to this whole sequence of events disappears. In 1922, Egypt declares independence. We read Iraq declares their independence in 1932. Jordan arises as Transjordan at the time, 1946. India, right before the UN vote, partitioned Israel, 1947. Israel obviously declares himself a state in 1948. This is Oman today. They declared independence in 1951. And Yemen in 1967. Now, the official end of the British Empire is debated between, when India declared independence, or in 1997, Britain pulled out of Hong Kong. After that, the only thing left, Britain. That's it. No more empire. Even Australia and all those other countries not on the map. Britain's empire is gone. It just doesn't exist. There's a Commonwealth, British Commonwealth, but that's not an empire. It's just like treaties with relationships with nations. However, this is where the prophecy of Revelation 16 comes to light. Because, it's the river Euphrates was to dry up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And that word prepared is to make ready. And this is exactly what happened. Now, note, it doesn't say the Euphrates dries up and the kings of the east come out. It's to prepare the way for them. There's the Ottoman Empire. It went into the hands of mediators who were holding the land specifically to create Arab states. Here we are today. Kings of the east of Palestine. It went from, just Ottoman hands to now we have Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. Which, interestingly, if you look in Psalm 83, every single one of them is mentioned. Now, Brother Thomas didn't foresee this, and it also helps you understand why he didn't really think Psalm 83 had anything to do with all the 10 nations that want to wipe Israel off the map. He didn't think that had to do with latter-day prophecy because he didn't foresee these nations coming out. But here they are today. So, looking back on history, we see Revelation 16 was fulfilled with incredible detail. Now, if Revelation 16, if the interpretation of that was wrong, in Daniel 11, the parallel prophecy of that, it necessitates. One's wrong, the other one must be incorrect as well. Now, I mean, obviously, I agree that the Ottomans are indeed mentioned in Daniel 11, like Brother Thomas thought, but it's to a far greater extent. I mean, they're like the main subject here. We're going to go through this sort of fast, and I can give this the time that it deserves. But Daniel 11, 40 through 43, if you want to open up your Bibles to that, I'll have most of the phrases up here. But if you start at verse 40, we're given incredible detail on how the Ottomans came to control the land of Palestine. And they wrested it from these people called Egyptian Mamluks. Now, you'll see, I mean, if you look at all the different kings of the south in Daniel 11, their borders match up perfectly with the other ones. So there's a pattern you see in Daniel 11. This fits it perfectly. Now, in 1516, the Mamluk Sultanate controlled all this land from Egypt, Libya, Egypt, all the way up to pretty much right where the earthquakes happened, the border of Syria and Turkey. Now, it says at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. The Ottomans, they're in the process of expanding their empires, and you can notice that the Ottoman territory is pretty much Turkey's borders today. It's very interesting. Note that. So the Mamluks to the south, were probably on the list next. So this man named Hamza al-Ghari, he moved all of his forces up to their northern border. He took he was a very selfish man, terrible ruler, apparently. He grabbed all the riches of Egypt, and he brought them on the way, and he left them down in Palestine in some city. So the Mamluks knew this was happening, so they struck first. Let's say push at them. And they actually penetrated the Ottoman territory very briefly. There was a battle that broke out, and it was called the Battle of Mars Dubik. And it was a very quick battle. The Sultan of the Mamluks was killed, and therefore all of the Mamluks, they just fled straight south. And they didn't stop until they reached Palestine. And it's with this one battle that the Ottomans gained all of the land, Syria, Lebanon, down into some parts of Palestine. It was one battle. I mean, they had no resistance as they got down to these borders here. Now, once in Palestine, another battle broke out. It was even faster than the first. And the Ottomans won that one as well. And then the Egyptians fled down to their homeland. Now, there's a reason why it says he overflows. It's very clear that the king of the north here is very fast progress. And it's because the Mamluks didn't have guns and the Ottomans did. The Mamluks, they thought it was un-Arab or un-Muslim-like to have guns. They kind of saw it as barbaric, whereas the Ottomans, if it's literally guns versus swords here, it's not even a battle. But also, we have the ships accounted for. You know, once they got down to, I think it was to Palestine there, you'll see his name there, the Ottoman leader's name Selim. He waited there until the Ottoman fleet, of the Navy fleet, came and met him there. They had 100 ships that they followed them down the coastline out down to Egypt, and they supplied the army along the way. So they continued their march down to Egypt. I guess I'll read some of these. The campaign had been supported by a fleet of about 100 ships that supplied the troops during their campaign to the south. And as this one other article says, the Ottoman Navy finally arrived, and Selim started his march toward Egypt. The journey through the Sinai was difficult. The Navy supplied the Ottoman army. And even Isaac Collier notices this. The Turkish power entered the glorious land and overthrew its many countries. But in Edom, Moab, and Ammon, which according to the prophecy were to escape, the Arabs have maintained a remarkable independence, specifically Bedouins, not just Arabs, but these Bedouins. Even today, they're living like they lived at this time, in tents and things like that. And after that, there was one swift battle in Egypt. Again, it was totally one-sided. The Ottomans just cremated the Mamluks. And they took over Egypt, and they had control over, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. the result is that they had obviously all the Mamluk Empire into the Ottoman Empire at this time. Now Libya was taken as a province, which is modern Sudan, and shortly after, this is what the Mamluk Empire looked like at its height. Tripoli, that's in Libya, that's in Ottoman control, and Ethiopia down to the bottom. They had them as like I said, it was a tributary. That's what it was. They paid them a ton of money. I don't know if they're actually in their empire, but they paid them tons of money unless they're at their feet. So as verses 40 to 43 detail the beginning of Ottoman control of the land. Verses 44 and 45 detail the end of Ottoman control of the land. And this was by the British. Now you'll notice there's a couple different fronts here. It says in scriptures, the tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble them. So that's, I believe, east and north of Israel. But interestingly, it's I guess it's not interesting. It's kind of common sense that it's also the eastern front of the Ottoman and their northern front. Now you'll notice up at the top there, we have some battle there. Now tidings from the east, I believe that is found in this Mesopotamian campaign by the British. So the Arabs had started weakening them. Actually, I think this is before they even appealed to the Arabs. They struck at their eastern front and they tried going up the Euphrates. I mean, the Euphrates is beginning to really dry up now. And it's no coincidence that the British are starting to push up and shrink their territory as they go. This began in November 14th, or November 1914. Now, there's a lot of battles going on. Britain, I think, won most of them. But near the end of the war, this is when Britain really made their advances. It's directly east of the Holy Land. It's on their eastern front. That's the tidings from the east. And the Ottomans did everything they could to stop them. They did for a while. And I think kind of related to the McMahon-Hussein correspondence with the Arab revolt, I think that has relation too, because the Arabs, Bedouins, under T.E. Lawrence in the east, rose up against the Ottomans. But I think if we're pointing it to one thing, I would say it is this. Now, the tidings from to the north, there's two things I think this relates to. But again, if I had to point to one, I had to say it's this Gallipoli campaign. We're on the Ottomans' northern front. Now, this was a combined effort by British and French forces from 1915 to January 16. And they tried to take the Ottoman capital, but it was probably the biggest failure in Winston Churchill's this whole, we would call it reign, this whole term. Britain lost over 200,000 troops. They didn't gain a single thing. I mean, the Ottomans just decimated them. Now, these are the two greatest fronts in World War I that they fought on. And also, if you see up on the top left-hand corner here, me pointing the computer's not going to do much good, is it? Now, this area, this is where they had some issues with the Russians. You can tell it's also north. These were called the Caucasus Campaign. But I think they went forth to utterly make away many, as it says in the scriptures. Now, I think the King James rendering of verse 45 is not really the best, because when you look at most other translations, they have it much more similar to this. King James makes it seem like he pitches his tent between the seas in Jerusalem, where all these other renderings, the RSV is my favorite of it, he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. So it's not between the two oceans and Jerusalem's the center. It's between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean. And this is precisely where the Ottomans lost their control of Palestine, which is the focus of all of Daniel 11, it seems. And so the British, under Allenby, they were able to push the Ottomans back until that very strip of land. And that's this southern push here. Now they held up in two towns between those two points. But all this is, there's three battles of Gaza and the Battle of Jerusalem. The Battle of Jerusalem is what ended Ottoman control of Palestine, it seems. But these are the areas. They held up in Ramleh, or Ramlah today, and there's a fortress in this place called Latrun. And it took with the three battles of Gaza, it took Britain 8 months to drive them from those points to Jerusalem. 8 months. And it's not, Israel's not very big. That's a small area. So that's where the Ottomans essentially made their final stand. Now, the other, it's not just Ottomans in this war, they have allies in Central Powers. But they were so occupied by the Entente, it was the Allies at this time, shouldn't use that word, Britain's other allies, that they couldn't help the Ottomans. The Ottomans were completely on their own, and so just as scriptures say, they came to their end, and none helped them. Because it ended with a treaty. It's not like it was just this gigantic, terrible obliteration. It's a treaty. It came to his end with none to help. And I was thinking about, if you go back to this map, you got these fronts. If that southern front was so important, if that's kind of what ended their control of the land, why doesn't Scripture say tidings from the south? I was actually laying in bed one night, my eyes just shot open because I think I understand. If you note, there's certain metaphors in Daniel 11 and Revelation 16 that tie these together. And there's a reason why the Ottoman Empire is called the Euphrates River, not just because it encapsulates the river. And I think this southern push from Allenby is mentioned, but it's by use of these metaphors. This metaphor, he shall enter into the countries, and the king of the north shall overflow and pass over. It's talking about, it's described by means of water. And in 1517, they overflowed, and they took over. If you look at it like just the river Euphrates, if it were to overflow, this is some of the land it would take. So in 1517, the Euphratean power overflows its borders. And then we have the end mentioned in Revelation 16, where the water dries up. In 1914, they entered a war. And at the end of it, their territory shrunk back to the same territory. You see, it's exactly the same. The Ottoman Turkey today. It's absolutely incredible. Because, if you think of when water overflows, when it dries up, in what direction does it dry up? The opposite. Those two arrows there, it overflows and it dries up. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Now, if we continue with the imagery, and you can take this for what it's worth, but if you think of land, when it's flooded, it's not usable at all. But when it dries up, that's some of the most fertile land. The Egyptians do that with the Nile all the time. So once this Ottoman Euphratean power dried up, the land was fertile for the king of the east to rise up. It was perfect for the Arabs. Now, it's important to notice, people who lived at this time, who saw these things happen, notice this is really, really similar to what Daniel 11 talks about. This is called here in this book called Daniel and Christ. He says, we were told in early days that the latter day king of the north was identical with Gog, referred to in Ezekiel 38. As a result of this early impression, we fell into an error from which perhaps others are not free. All that can honestly be said is that the description of the king of the north in Daniel 11 is sufficiently in accord with the prophecy of Ezekiel that it may possibly relate to the same event. I disagree with that, but nevertheless. In view of the fact that this invasion is said to occur at the time of the end, we might naturally assume the identity of the king of the north would go. But the fact that another interpretation is so supported by history that it is difficult to suppose that there is nothing by coincidence in the matter. So all he's saying is something's happened that fits this much better than what Brother Thomas was saying. And he explains his interpretation. The Turks, and this is of Daniel 11, the Turks coming from the north of Palestine and originally from beyond Euphrates, not only stormed against the Roman power, but as the prophecy suggests, this Euphratean flood overflowed and passed over. The Turks came with horses and chariots and many ships. They took the land of Egypt and had dominion over its treasures. The Turkish power entered into the glorious land and overthrew its many countries, but in Edom, Moab, and Ammon, which according to the prophecy were to escape, the Arabs have maintained a remarkable independence. The Turk planted his power in the glorious Holy Mountain, and for many years Palestine was under his heel. But in the year 1917, he was driven right out of the land with a terrible overflow, and he came to his end as king of the north. Here then is a possible meaning of the text which cannot be ignored. Now, You might notice a little bit difference of 40 to 43. Talks about the Ottomans storming against the Roman power. And I think he just has a little bit of history mixed up here. Because the Ottomans took the land, but it wasn't the Ottomans that took it from the Romans. The Romans lost Palestine in 634 AD to this. It's the Muslim Rashidun Caliphate. So they lost the land in 634 AD. Ottomans didn't get it till 1517. So there's some history things there, but the general thing is, you notice World War I was super. It came in line with what Daniel 11 says. So I wish we had time to discuss the prophecy of Daniel 11 as it continues, because it gets into the 40s, I think, and so on, up to our present day. Obviously not completely fulfilled, but our time's obviously up. Relevance, real quick. Firstly, Daniel 11, 40 through 45 is not relevant to the latter-day prophecy from our point forward. If you consider World War I latter-day, sure, but from our point forward, it just throws a wrench in all the gears when you're trying to figure things out. Secondly, there's no scriptural basis for Russia coming against Turkey. I searched, and actually this is what started me on this, is why did he think Russia would come against Turkey? Because they're allies in Ezekiel 38, not enemies. This was the basis. It's gone. Things just didn't happen as he expected. And specifically, he wasn't talking about Turkey itself. He's talking about the Turkish Ottoman Empire. So I know there's many today who's, Russia's got to come against Turkey because Brother Thomas taught that. He didn't. He taught that they'd come against the Ottomans who are gone today. And lastly, there's no basis for Britain being a protector of Israel. They've done their part. They became an enemy of Israel, and now they're gone. I just saw something. I think the role of Britain has been overstated heavily. I think obviously there are scriptures that talk about them in the latter days and the kingdom age, but the Church of England, I just saw that they were just talking about whether God is gender neutral or not. I mean, they're not a righteous nation by any stretch of the imagination. But I've heard people say that, well, Britain's got to go back in the land to protect Israel from Gog. They don't. It's just not going to happen. I'm sorry. It's over with. Now, having studied this, I have no reservations at all now that I've learned what Brother Thomas thought and why. Were he alive today, he would have changed his thoughts, because he thought Edom, Ammon, and Moab, he thought that talked about Britain, which is Jordan today. He thought it talked about Britain because he thought Britain would be there. Well, that's Arab Jordan today. So knowing his basis, going on a geographical basis, that Jordan's there today, they're talked about in prophecy, and therefore it's not Britain, it's the Arabs it's talking about. And it's obviously no dishonor to Brother Thomas, but it's our duty as students of the Word, to try the spirits to ensure they're sound as we look for these signs moving forward. And that's what we've tried to do this morning here. The work is not done. I think sometimes we kind of think, well, they wrote all these things down for us, pioneer brethren, and we just got to learn it. That's not the case at all, especially prophecy. I mean, first principles, obviously, those are ironclad, but prophecy, we've got a lot to learn still. Things like the Holocaust, formation of Israel, the extent of Arab Jewish immigration to the land, Arab countries, all these things Brother Thomas just didn't foresee, and that we're seeing today and need to understand in light of Scripture. And so, in the terms of Revelation 16, the Euphrates power dried up, the kings of the east have been prepared, and so we're now in the time when the frog-like spirits go forth to the kings of the earth to gather them to the battle of Armageddon, to rebel against Christ when he returns. And do we not see that all these things that the world is taking on and believing that are going to cause them to rebel against Christ when he says, submit to my gospel. And it's our duty to keep ourselves pure and free from these frog-like spirits, so we can gratefully and joyfully accept our Lord when he arrives.